Okay, good morning everyone. Kia ora koutou katoa, and welcome back from morning tea, which was kindly sponsored by Marsh. Hope you enjoyed that. I'm Andrew Bashford, Head of Institutional Relationships at Westpac, and my job is to be your MC this morning. It's to welcome you and set the scene and navigate the session on climate change, resilience and sustainability. Now, for most people, it's scientifically indisputable that climate change is real and impacting the natural, social, human, financial and physical capitals that all support our well-being. NIWA projects, without effective reductions, sea levels will rise by actually 1 metre in the next 100 years, which is quite scary. And astonishingly, already 1/3 of the ice volume in the Southern Alps has disappeared. Now, if you don't believe scientists, how about some reputable bankers? And it's not an oxymoron. Mark Carney has actually said that global warming could render the assets of many financial companies worthless, and Adrian Orr has cited climate change as a risk to financial stability. But right here and now we face unprecedented health and economic crises due to COVID, which could distract us but needs to be exploited to create the impetus to address our huge infrastructure deficit. The Prime Minister said it's anywhere between 25 and 75 billion. Our weak productivity performance, 46th in the world, well, in the OECD, and we've got obviously the opportunity to deliver better social and environmental outcomes. Now, resilient and sustainable infrastructure are key enablers for these outcomes. Starting us off this morning is Dr. Rod Carr, Chairman of the Climate Change Commission. It's worth noting that the Commission has an incredibly important task ahead of it this year, and that's advising the government on the transition to a low-emission future and how the country can achieve its climate goals. Please welcome Dr. Carr. He's on Zoom. I'm not sure if we'll be able to hear you, but please welcome him, who will set the scene and provide the backdrop in terms of the climate risk challenges we face and how we can improve resilience. Thank you.
Let me first start with a few little data points to add to those that Andrew has already addressed. Currently, our fossil-fuelled economy largely is responsible for contributing nearly 55 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum into our atmosphere. That's an all-time record, bar only the setback that was the 4 billion tonnes less as a result of COVID lockdowns around the world. How do you imagine 55 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents? Well, the first thing is the equivalent of about 600 active medium-sized volcanoes. How might we think about what we've done relative to historical times? Well, we have contributed as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as has not been seen for 80 million years. And indeed, one of the challenges is that our climate scientists say that in the last 300 million years, planetary temperatures have oscillated between -4 degrees and +2 degrees from where they are today. 300 million years of relatively stable planetary temperature. With the carbon dioxide and its equivalent gases emitted into the atmosphere, we are on track not only to add the 1.1 degree of global warming since pre-industrial revolution times, but to surge past 1.5 and past the milestone of 2 degrees, unless we take decisive action. That decisive action requires us to reduce globally our gross emissions by nearly a half by 2030 to have some prospect of being in the zone of the 1.5 to 2 degree target. Let me for a moment reflect on the risks that global warming poses. The Ministry for the Environment published New Zealand's first national risk assessment. If you haven't read it, read it. It identifies 43 risks, which it groups together in 5 categories, and then picks 2 priorities in each of those categories. And of interest to this particular forum will be things like the threat and risk to drinking water, the threat to the built environment from more violent climate, a wetter, windier, as well as warmer and drier world. The National Risk Assessment is a backdrop to the work the Climate Change Commission is tasked to do. The Commission is not all things climate change. The Commission is responsible for providing advice, it has no regulatory powers, to the government of the day and monitoring performance and outcomes. Our first stream of advice is to consider what emissions New Zealand should make if it is to be on track to meet its statutory targets and international obligations. Let's for a moment remind ourselves of what those statutory targets are. It is that we should reduce our biogenic methane emissions by between 24 and 47% by 2050. And that in respect of all other greenhouse gases, we should be at net zero. That is, all our gross emissions should be offset by removals. And our international obligations under the Paris Agreement are essentially that for this decade, we will contribute no more than 601 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, net of any removals that we make largely from afforestation. The question for the Commission is, what are the budgets for greenhouse gas equivalent emissions between now and 2025, between 2026 and 2030, and between 2031 and 2035 that would be consistent with those domestic targets and international obligations? To do its work, the Commission obviously has to think about where we are today and the trajectory we believe we're on in the absence of any other action. Because if we think we're on the right path to achieve those targets and meet our international obligations, then there is little more advice to do except to monitor progress and make sure we remain on track. The early work of the Commission makes it pretty clear that we are not on that track, that we will need to have a plan, an emissions reduction plan, that will provide advice to the government on the direction of policy needed to put us on that path. That emissions reduction plan is, in my view, where all the action is. Budgets are budgets, plans are what we need to do. The Commission will, on the 1st of February, present for public consultation New Zealand's first set of emissions budgets and the emission reduction plan. Put it in your diary, make time. The plan is only going to be as good as the evidence it's based on, and that is informed by frontline actors who have their feet in the mud and have their hands on the tools. For 6 weeks, we'll be open for public consultation, and then we'll gather that feedback, amend, I'm sure, our advice, and present final advice to the government on the 31st of May next year. The government will have 20 working days to reflect on that advice before it must be made public. And the government will have until the 31st of December to settle and adopt emissions reduction plans consistent with its adopted emissions budgets. When it comes to New Zealand's emissions, the agricultural sector has been in the limelight as playing a significant part through biogenic methane emissions. But let's set agriculture to one side. For the moment, let's consider the other half of all our emissions. 40% of that half essentially arises from transport. What we own, what we operate, how we get from here to there. We are not going to meet our targets and obligations unless we have a transformation of mobility. More active mobility, more safe places to walk to work and school, more safe places to ride to work and school, more lower intensity, lower emitting modes of transport per kilometre travelled, more public transport, more e-mobility, and significantly less internal combustion engines, whether they be in buses or whether they be in cars driven for profit or cars owned for personal use. The decarbonisation of mobility is non-negotiable. The issues we need to address are how we do it in a way that is inclusive, particularly of the most vulnerable members of our society, and how we do it at pace. Part of it is clearly about making sure that there is a network for e-mobility charging. But that is a small part of the gains that have to be made. We need the infrastructure to support choices, good choices that New Zealanders will make about where they live and work and how they get around. Your sector has a significant part to play in finding those solutions that New Zealand can afford and must adopt. In the energy sector, we also have to make significant investments and transformational change. The government has committed itself to 100% renewable electricity. The thing to remember is that only 40% of all New Zealand's energy consumed is produced from renewable sources. And the decarbonisation of energy production along with electricity generation is critical. We may not quite achieve our electricity target of 100% renewable, but it is absolutely essential that we have a significant and rapid increase in the proportion of all energy which is generated from renewable sources. Again, your sector has a significant part to play in creating the plans and implementing the plans that will give New Zealand what it must have, which is sustainable sources of renewable energy to power a thriving, climate resilient, low emissions future. When it comes to putting its work together, the Commission is building a reference case, what happens if all that we do is the policies that are in place given the circumstances we start in today. That reference case is the one that says we're not going to be on track. We then think about scenarios because there is a high degree of uncertainty about the decade that lies ahead. But we think there are two big drivers to put us on the right track. The first is about technology. Are we able to assume that technology will break in our favour? That new advances in technology will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture and energy production? Will the built environment enable energy efficiency to give us some of the gains sooner? Or will we discover that technology is harder than we think, more expensive and slower to develop and holds us back from meeting our needed change? The second dimension is around behaviour change. Do we assume that we are living in a world where behaviours change rapidly? People are willing to embrace new and different ways of working, new and different products and services in our everyday lives? Or do we assume that behaviour change is slower than we might expect? We hang and cling to our fossil-based past as we walk into the future. If technology goes our way and our behaviours change, we call that our tailwind scenario. We find ourselves in a relatively likely place to meet our targets and international obligations. But if we find ourselves with technology not breaking in our favour and our behaviours of reluctant change, our headwind scenario mean more policy action is going to be essential, more interventions and higher prices for carbon than would otherwise be the case. In our work, you will see the assumptions that we are making about the various pathways and the policy actions that would be consistent with those various scenarios. You will be invited to form your own views and make your own contribution before the advice of the Commission is finalised. But the Commission is not idle. The climate waits for no one. So in April this year, knowing that as a result of COVID, there would be significant fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus available, we wrote to Minister James Shaw outlining 6 principles for spending and investment. That letter is on our website. But let me quickly remind you, because I've come to believe that these 6 principles can guide private sector investment and spending, not just central government spending and investment. The first of those principles is look at all your spending and investment decisions through a climate change lens. The climate is changing, that is a fact. Secondly, bring forward investment decisions and investing that you will have to make in the coming decade, and do it sooner. Do it now, while there is underutilised capacity in the economy. Thirdly, act in partnership. There is no silver bullet, no green cannonball, no single actor alone who is going to address the issues that we need to address. Find partners in central and local government, in the private sector. Find partners in iwi Māori groupings, in the not-for-profit organisations. Leverage the contribution you can make by compounding it with initiatives, actions and information of others. Fourthly, we need to train our labour force for the skills of the 21st century, not the 19th and 20th century, or we will face skill shortages that impede our progress, even if the money is available and we are willing to change. We also make the point that price must be allowed to play its part, whether it's through the pricing of an NZU in the emissions trading scheme, or whether it's the use of incentives and subsidies. The reality is that price must be allowed to play its part, but it can be only a part of what needs to be done. It is apparent that the most vulnerable in our society may be significantly adversely affected if we move from a carbon-based economy to a sustainable but renewable-based economy too rapidly. We need to move rapidly, but we need to be inclusive. And finally, we draw attention to the fact that we do need to think about what we measure. Gross domestic product is a measure of busyness in our economy that has been monetised and is therefore able to be taxed. But there are a number of things that we need to do, and we need to measure them, and they may not actually add to GDP. If you walk to work instead of buying petrol for your car, GDP is lower than it would otherwise have been. If you choose to reuse old stuff rather than buy new stuff, GDP will be lower than it would otherwise have been. And if through energy efficiency you buy less electricity and burn less gas, GDP will be less than it otherwise would have been. So in your own businesses, think about the dashboard of measures that will help you live in a low emission society, which is coming to you sometime soon. The Commission's work will not, however, finish with its published budgets and emissions reduction plan. We are also tasked to monitor progress against that plan. to review the National Adaptation Plan that will be prepared by the Ministry for the Environment and adopted by the government. And we are also required to give advice on the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and whether our nationally determined contribution is consistent with our commitments under the Paris Agreement. There is much work to be done and many opportunities for your sector, industry and participants to contribute. Often young people ask me, what can they do when they're not leaders of business, elected representatives of the people? And I give them 4 things they can do. The first is every time you buy something, you're voting for that thing to be put back on the shelf. Be a conscious consumer. Whether you're in business, buying through your supply lines, or whether you're a householder buying from the supermarket. Come to know and understand the carbon footprint of your purchases. Every dollar is a vote. Secondly, talk about it. Be an advocate. Put pressure on your family, your friends, your peers, your business partners to take climate action, to take it now, and to be proud of the action you take. Thirdly, I tell young people to put pressure on their employers, the place of work. They can influence the actions and conduct of their business owners and their managers in ways that are quite profound. And finally, I remind them all that in a democracy, you get the leaders you choose. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you about the work of the Commission and the important agenda for climate action that the world has now signed up for. All of the G7 countries are on board. China is committed to net zero by 2060. Most of the other G7 by 2050. The world is moving. The future is now. Climate action is inevitable. Kia ora.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking presentation, Dr. Carr. A couple of things for me. One is to be a conscious consumer. Second, we all need to look out for this report out on the 1st of February and make sure we contribute to that climate action plan. So put that in your diaries. Now, next on our dance card is a thought leadership video from the UK's Department of International Trade. As host of next year's UN Climate Change Conference of Parties, the UK government is a leading global voice on climate change, and the following video outlines the department's thoughts on priorities and collaboration opportunities to build back better.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Laura Clark, British High Commissioner to New Zealand. The UK and our Department for International Trade are delighted to be taking part in this year's Building Nations Conference. The UK and New Zealand have many shared interests and values. Last year, we were 2 of the first countries in the world to make legal commitments to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Through collaboration in key sectors like infrastructure, we can continue to build back better from the economic impact of COVID with green and resilient recoveries. The UK is and has long been at the forefront of innovation. We built the first underground passenger railway in 1863, the first passenger jet plane in 1952, and the world's largest offshore wind farm in 2013. And we keep innovating. Home to cutting-edge technologies and world-leading low-carbon practices, the UK is well placed to work with New Zealand's infrastructure on key projects in rail, water, airports and urban renewal. The UK's COP26 presidency, our presidency of the big UN Climate Change Conference, will focus on 5 areas: clean energy, clean transport, nature-based solutions, adaptation and resilience, and finance. In July, we announced a plan to invest over 5.5 billion New Zealand dollars to improve the energy efficiency of homes and public buildings. Since March, we've committed almost $2 billion New Zealand dollars in the transition to electric vehicles, including research funding, grants for consumers, and investment in infrastructure. The public and private sectors have a critical role to play in delivering green and resilient recoveries. Arup and Mott MacDonald are two UK companies in the infrastructure sector that focus on sustainability, and both have a presence here in New Zealand. Arup was recently appointed by the UK government as a sustainability consultant for COP26.
We're now facing climate change challenges, and the world is looking towards a viable transition and looking at alternatives to hydrocarbon use and, that just transition away from oil and gas. This is where the New Zealand government has decided that they needed to look at the opportunity that hydrogen could bring.
And Mott MacDonald is also particularly focused on sustainability in infrastructure.
It's a website, pick it up on your phone, it's the easiest way, and it will literally find where you are and it'll take you to the closest beaches, so it really is a quick process. Currently on the website you'll see over 100 beaches in Auckland, but in fact we're taking water quality samples at over 240.
To close, modern infrastructure is at the heart of our communities and contributes extensively to our sense of well-being and community. Infrastructure connects us locally and connects us globally. As both our countries look to rebuild from COVID, we need to be designing, building and delivering for a green and resilient recovery. Together we can build back better. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Excellent. So now it is my pleasure to actually invite someone here who's in person, and it is my absolute pleasure because it's my colleague Joanna Silver, who's Head of Sustainable Finance at Westpac. Joanna, it's fair to say, is a very passionate advocate and expert on the topic of climate change and financial solutions that support investment in assets and businesses that are sustainable and resilient. Today, she will discuss how climate risk is a business risk, what this means for infrastructure, and how we can finance the transition. Please welcome Joanna to the stage.
Thanks, Andrew. Rauranga tira mā, tēnei te mihi nui, kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. My background is in commercial law and strategy, and an even longer background in carbon markets and climate change policy. So it's quite hard to believe that I now find myself in banking, of all places, and at the heart of the hottest trend in finance, being sustainable finance. But it's the right place to be, as it brings together many of the things that we at Westpac care about, talking to our customers every day about how climate risk is business risk, and how we can help them navigate their way through this operating environment, maximise their opportunities for stakeholder engagement and innovation, and finance their transition. Firstly, a few parallels with COVID-19 and climate change. The lockdowns in 2020 taught us that when we listen to science, we can make informed decisions which may create some short, sharp economic pain, but will result in medium, longer-term benefits to society and the economy. The lockdowns also highlighted the extent of our interconnectedness with nature in a way that many of us might not previously have been aware, that we're an inherent part of Earth's living systems. We depend entirely on it for survival. We exist in a pretty narrow environmental niche, the Goldilocks zone, if you like, not too hot, not too cold. We need certain amounts of rainfall to grow, and we like that food to grow food, and we like that food to be high in protein. We need clean air and the thriving biodiverse ecosystems that make our lives possible. But outside of these limits, we struggle. And as New Zealand found with COVID-19, fast action now is way more cost effective than paying later for the consequences of not acting. And the same mindset applies in relation to climate change. And despite the uncertainty of 2020, people are still focused on climate action. At the large climate change and sustainable finance events that have all been squeezed into this month, we've not once heard that climate change priorities should be shelved until we've managed the economic consequences of COVID-19. And this, I think, is in part because the pandemic has sharpened people's minds on the need to better manage our interrelationship with nature, the biggest of which is climate change. And it's this mindset that's going to help us determine what to build and how. In economics, there's a phrase called path dependency. And this means that when you embark on a path, for example, everyone's going to travel to work in a car. So you build bigger and better roads. And it turns out 50 or 100 years into that, you realise that isn't actually the smartest, fastest or cheapest way to get into work. But now we're on that path and it's very difficult to switch from one path to another. You've got locked-in capital and locked-in long-term contracts. You've got vested interests, car makers, car lovers, petrol importers, road engineers, and so on. And perhaps you haven't properly positioned alternatives to offer a viable solution, rail, bike lanes. So if you want to get out of a path-dependent system, you need to disrupt that system. And you in the room today have the ability to do that. Looking at the roles of the 860 delegates at this conference, every single one here today has a role to remove the country from a path dependency on fossil fuels and high energy using systems and structures that will not withstand climate change. Excuse me, this room's 16 degrees. To create a thriving, resilient and net zero emissions economy, we will have to shift our focus to building productive and sustainable systems that nest within the Earth system, of which we're an inherent part. So now we're just going to look a little bit more at climate risk and why it is business risk, and then at the role that infrastructure and ultimately finance can play in creating a better and more viable future for New Zealand. Now, Dr. Rod Carr stole on some of my points, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of the key ones. Starting off with the macro lens, in the last 100 years, our climate, as Dr. Carr said, has already warmed 1 degree, and we're currently on track for 3 to 4 degrees. And given, as you may recall, he said in 300 million years the planet has never operated above 2, we don't really know what 2 degrees looks like. And the simplest way I could think of conveying it to you today was something that was said by a professor at Exeter University, who said that for each 1 degree rise, 1 billion people will be forced to live in conditions that we today consider uninhabitable. So think Sahara, but hotter and drier. And the authors of that study, who've been studying climate change for quite a long time, said they were floored and blown away by the findings. They hadn't expected our species to be quite so vulnerable. So perhaps instead of thinking of climate change as a problem of physics or economics, maybe it's a problem of human habitat. Maybe this isn't a climate emergency, it's a humanity emergency. And just to scare you a little more, we have increasing evidence that we're rapidly moving away from the safe operating space for humanity on Earth because the climate has reached a global crisis point. We're close to crossing what are known as tipping points that will shift the planet to start actually working against us and amplifying the heat. Because the biophysical systems that have a function of regulating our climate are moving and shifting in a way that no longer enables them to perform those functions. So we're pressing unstoppable buttons in the Earth systems. Therefore, to Rod's point, the next 10 years to 2030 is where we must see the most profound transformation the world has probably ever known. And the countdown has started. It's really simple maths. We need to halve our emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050, ideally sooner. So what does all this big macro stuff mean for New Zealand? Again, I'm sure he saw my speech before he spoke. As Dr. Rod Carr mentioned this morning, the Ministry for the Environment in August presented the findings of New Zealand's first national climate change risk assessment. And I'd echo the same sentiment. Read this if you are involved in planning, investing in, advising on, building or owning infrastructure in New Zealand. Local Government New Zealand estimated a couple of years ago that the total value of all infrastructure assets at risk from sea level rise is between 8 and 13 billion New Zealand dollars. And climate risk is so much more than just sea level rise, so that number is massively bigger. It's also about how and whether we can live with the extreme weather and the changes in rainfall and temperature and the flow-on effects of that. And if you have a look even at the summary of that risk assessment, there are some pretty key questions that leap out to you. Is there water that we can actually drink? in a 2-degree world? Can our infrastructure manage the waste and stormwater impacts? How do communities remain connected when displaced? Can the country's agricultural sector produce food at above 2 degrees? And can existing buildings handle the extreme winds and storms, and our existing infrastructure withstand all these impacts? Basically, did we build the right stuff? So the counterfactual of the world not hitting 1.5 degrees target doesn't look good for New Zealand at all. Every sector is affected by climate change, and therefore all businesses need to play their part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what is called mitigation, and responding to climate change, i.e. adaptation. So how does this climate risk, translate into risk for business? The context for business risk has been materially altered by climate change. Firstly, there's been a shift in focus from shareholders to stakeholders and the role of business. At Westpac's recent Sustainable Finance Summit earlier this month, Rob Campbell said capitalism remains, but shareholder primacy is shifting to stakeholder capitalism. And stakeholders aren't just your shareholders, they're your customers, your employees, your suppliers, and your supply chain, and the communities in which you operate. They are more empowered and more informed, and they need to be kept happy because that social licence is a privilege. We rightly focus on physical and transition risks associated with climate change, but reputational risks are equally as important. Consumer activism on climate change is on the rise, particularly among a new generation of consumers and investors. So if you're ignoring climate change in your future infrastructure plans, you are at risk of being stranded with assets of no use and of no customers. Secondly, there's also been a change in the dialogue around climate change globally and locally. There are now real-world legal and economic implications for those who don't manage climate risk and start their transition. Litigation risks associated with inaction are likely to become more prominent. And there'll be an inability to build plans flowing from decisions that are blind to climate risk. And the best example there is how the third runway at Heathrow was stymied when the Court of Appeal in England found that the UK government acted unlawfully in failing to consider its obligations under the Paris Agreement on climate change. It said the government's actions were irrational and unlawful. Decision makers across the economy will need to be conscious of these potential consequences when considering infrastructure projects in the future. And thirdly, the government is shaping the context around climate change by increasing the amount of information available to investors, analysts, customers, regulators, employees, and communities. In the next 2 years, government is mandating climate risk disclosure by over 200 listed issuers, banks, asset managers, and insurers, who will soon be required to undertake formal climate risk reporting on a comply or explain basis. Many large businesses in New Zealand don't currently have a good understanding of how climate change will impact what they do. And mandated climate risk reporting will massively change this. And in some cases, the emperor will have no clothes. Chapman Tripp, in their toolkit on climate risk for directors, said something very simple that I think is a great takeaway here. Management of climate risk is not about compliance. Understanding climate risk is key to mid to long-term strategy and resilience. So managing your climate risk is really just now good business. So what does this mean for infrastructure and for you in the room? It means decarbonising every aspect of our lives and the big systems that run our lives that everyone in this room is a part of. Energy, transport, industry, buildings, agriculture, from being a source of emissions to being a store of carbon, and protecting the natural ecosystems that help us store carbon. Infrastructure, particularly for the energy and water and transport sectors, has a long lead time, so needs to be in the right place in 50, 80 or 100 years. And it needs to be climate resilient. So it needs to either reduce emissions or enable New Zealand to adapt to climate change, or ideally both. And also we have to take societal needs into account too. Does the infrastructure create jobs? Does it help reduce social inequality? Are there some triple wins to be gained there? What we build matters for the long term and influences the decisions of generations to come. And if we approach these crises with the right mindset, then our responses can open up real opportunities to create long-term sustainable value for future generations. And business risk affects returns as well, but also creates investment opportunities. There's an increasing recognition by the capital markets that climate risk is business risk. The core function of the capital markets is to evaluate and price risk. And capital then flows to where it can earn the highest risk-adjusted return over time. So if we properly evaluate and account for the benefits and costs of climate change, then a strong investment case can be made to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And leadership matters, and business can work faster than government on climate change and needs to. From a policy perspective, as we heard James Shaw say last week, the last 3 years have really involved setting up a lot of frameworks, architecture and institutions, the Zero Carbon Bill, putting a cap on our cap and trade scheme, the Climate Change Commission, the Green Investment Fund, and mandating climate risk reporting. But we haven't actually cut any emissions yet. In fact, we're on track not only to not hit our Paris Agreement targets, but to actually increase our emissions. The climate change budgets that Dr. Carr mentioned earlier next year will help set up the right policy environments for business to respond, and key sector-based signals will flow from these. But don't wait for those. Smart businesses are increasingly focusing on climate change and on their broader sustainability issues. We're seeing sustainability strategies and corporate strategies aligning, singing off the same song sheet, as it were. Many businesses are not waiting for the regulation, as the other drivers that we've spoken about are making them act sooner. Climate and temperature change predictions, resulting weather and economic impacts, legal, financial, stakeholder risks, and disclosure. It's a pretty compelling list. The public and the private sectors are collaborating more, as Rod said, seek out partners, and data is increasingly informing decision on where the spend needs to occur. And to touch on something highlighted by Laura just then, nature-based solutions have a role to play as well. They represent a new framing of our relationship with nature and be quite a powerful ally in the battle against climate change. For example, protecting wetlands can secure and regulate water supply. New ecosystems in cities can help with cooling, flood abatement, reduce air pollution and provide mental and physical health benefits. And many other cities have done this, so we can follow suit here. Some interesting examples: climate tiles in Denmark are a form of pavement that protects against increased rainfall, taking the load off the roads and the sewer system. Portland and Oregon invested $9 million in green infrastructure and has since found the initiatives have saved $224 million in sewer outflow costs. And just last night, I spoke to somebody from a local council who has 6 options for replacement of their wastewater system. And the natural option of using wetlands as part of the solution is by far the cheapest, and it doesn't tie up otherwise productive land. We talk a lot to our customers about climate risk, as understanding the impact that climate change can have on your strategy is common sense. And my suggestion is don't wait for government-mandated disclosure requirements, get going now. You can look into the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's all open source, it's easy to find. You can review other climate risk disclosure statements, some great examples of those, Meridian and Orion. You can ensure you have in place on the board or in the senior leadership or in your advisor group the right expertise. So if you are an advisor on infrastructure, and most of you are, get up to speed on climate risk and bring that knowledge into your customer conversations. Identify and engage with all of your stakeholders, particularly your consumers and your supply chain. Explore whether your emissions trajectory is aligned to a 1.5 degree pathway or goes wildly beyond it. And consider the actions that your company could take now to reduce its exposure to physical, legal and commercial risks on the horizon from climate change. Soon, Westpac will be disclosing our own climate risk based on our lending portfolio. For as with most companies, climate risk is financial risk. For the last 18 months, we've been exploring the impact of sea level rise on our business. Many homes, commercial properties and farms have mortgages on them with us. And while insurance is currently widely available, we know that risk-based pricing is coming. So through our lending, we're exposed because our customers' risks are our risks. And that's not just a long-term risk, it's closer than many people think, as climate impacts are becoming increasingly visible and some properties are already objectively uninsurable. And through our work, we've developed a much better understanding of what turns these natural impacts into financial impacts. And that's important because it helps us to respond holistically and strategically. In fact, drilling deeper and analysing what drives the risks provides the kind of insight you need to connect the dots and make those right strategic decisions. For example, Westpac's now going to be paying a lot more attention to resource management legislation, which is not exactly the core competency of a bank. And then lastly, just touching on how to finance that transition. As being from a bank, this is hugely important to us. Banks provide the majority of capital into the New Zealand economy, so we have to take a lead here and align our balance sheets to pressing environmental and social priorities. Climate change is one of the top priorities on our list. The sustainable finance markets are evolving to respond to the changing needs of our customers. 3 years ago, the Sustainable Finance Toolkit really only had green bonds and a handful of social bonds. Now we have sustainability bonds and performance-linked mechanisms, loans where the amount of interest charged by the lender changes based on the performance of material and ambitious sustainability targets. And this structure has been extended into the bond market, not yet in New Zealand, but it will come. Green loans are being increasingly sought by our customers, and transition finance is started to be talked about. That's for those issuers or borrowers who are not natural green bond issuers, as they're large greenhouse gas emitters, but the proceeds of their borrowing are being used to finance or refinance new or existing transition projects, i.e. ones that enable a low carbon performance or substantial emission reductions over a period of time, coal to gas or fuel efficiency. Global markets have really embraced sustainable finance, and New Zealand is following. Since June 2018, there have been 14 sustainable bond issuance by New Zealand issuers, exceeding $5.5 billion. And next year will be a big sustainable debt year for New Zealand, both in bonds and loans. So in summary, COVID-19, like COVID-19, climate change does not observe borders, national or physical. And like COVID-19, listening to science and understanding our interconnectedness with nature can de-risk the impacts and create opportunities. These problems can only be managed through collective action that starts long before they become full-blown crises. We're nearing the stage of full-blown crisis with climate change, so climate action by every business is necessary and now. The toolkit we've discussed today is one of many resources there to help you. So school up on the climate risks to your business and engage in the work of the Climate Commission starting on 1 February next year. And at Westpac, we would love to help you plan, invest in, advise on, build or own infrastructure that sits at the heart of clean technology, positive health and societal outcomes, increased economic value and resilience to climate change, and then together, as a country, we can succeed. The pandemic has revealed that overnight, transformational change is possible. A different world and a different economy is dawning. What role will the infrastructure that you play? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. The key thing that comes out of that for me is that managing climate risk is both good for business and actually good for society in general. So, how to think about infrastructure, what it enables and the possibilities it presents is the theme of the next video from Adrian Miller and Ainsley Simpson from the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. ISCA is a not-for-profit operating across New Zealand and Australia with the purpose of enabling sustainability outcomes. One tangible way they do this is via its own rating scheme for infrastructure sustainability. If we could roll the video.
It's an interesting journey we are on in the infrastructure sector, with many twists and turns. For a long time, infrastructure was only about the amazing engineering and technical competency exhibited in the asset. What we celebrated was the asset itself. Then that started to change. We increasingly started to understand the asset needed to do more than be. In providing services, it must meet the needs of people and communities and be an enabler for their aspirations. A further twist was when we realised it could do and enable even more, that the capital projects and operation of infrastructural assets could themselves be a vehicle for broader outcomes and wider good, right across the life cycle of the asset. COVID recovery thinking has resulted in another wave of change. We are seeing a rising tide of awareness around resilience and climate change and the risk and opportunity it represents. There's a desire for prosperity and better outcomes for people and planet. How we respond as an industry to that demand shapes the way investors evaluate projects and assets, how staff assess and select employers, and indeed our sector, and our customers' customers choose to spend their money. Sustainability is a new way of thinking. It involves culture change, but it's an opportunity not to be missed. Done well, it's at the heart of social licence. Our industry and what we plan and build needs to stand tall, evolve and be resilient in the face of economic, climate and societal change. We can't always see around the corner, but it seems fairly likely that around the next bend we'll see data and AI deployed to tell us more about use, preference, design, integrated networks and journeys. Yes, it's a journey and one we're all on together, and it matters not where you are in that journey, in the starting blocks, taking small steps or making giant leaps. The important thing is continuing to make strides, because every incremental step is progress. It's an opportunity to do and enable more together. Find out how your organisation, project or asset can do more.
But it is well worth checking out the website actually and have a look at the ratings tool. So I'd encourage you to do that. So from the preceding presentations, it's clear that uncertainty and risks are both friends and foes of the future. So how do we proceed? Do we embrace the opportunity or ignore the challenge? Now, our next panel is very familiar with these issues, and we look forward to hearing their views on implications for New Zealand and how we should actively and urgently respond. So I'd like to invite the moderator, Tracey Ryan, up to the stage together with the panellists.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi, I'm Tracey Ryan, the Managing Director of Aurecon and also on the Board of Infrastructure New Zealand and also the Chair of the Sustainable Development Committee of FIDIC. So I'm really delighted to be here with my fantastic panellists today. We've been told we're kind of shortening ourselves a little bit, so we've about 30 minutes together. And please, this is your time now. This is your time to get very interactive. We've been listening a lot and we've had fantastic, I suppose, introduction from Joanna, from Adrian, from Laura and from Dr. Rob Carr, which really sets the scene, which we're going to kind of hopefully talk about today. But please, you can put questions in if you feel, and for me, I haven't got my app working yet, I think there could be a roving mic, so just put up your hand if you just want to ask a question directly in that sort of way. So, and look, I'm not going to repeat what has said, but what I would like to say is that it's quite clear from what we're experiencing and what we've been hearing already today that, you know, the COVID crisis has really highlighted the need for flexibility and resilience in our infrastructure. And factors that pretty much have often been secondary or tertiary sort of priorities before. But what is very clear, and what is clear now, is that the question is not of when, but it's more about, it's the question of when, not if, our infrastructure will be hit by climate change and other economic, environmental and social factors, which we've ultimately, Joanna has kind of touched on and prepped us very well in terms of that. And as an industry, you know, it is time from some very big thinking around how we build flexibility into our future and to create not only a sustainable but a flexible future for that. So I'm pleased to say that I have been joined by 4 big thinkers who are really going to hopefully get into the debate. we said we want to be a bit of the fun panelists and we want to kind of stimulate some good discussion today. So please get behind us and hopefully we will get. But James did say if we don't get to answer all your questions today in this session, we will hang around afterwards. We're over lunch, so please come and find out if some of your questions don't get answered today. Right, rather than me introduce, I'm going to leave everyone quite quickly introduce themselves and just say why they're here today, why this is important. So I'll start with you, Anita.
Thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. So I'm Anita Wreford, I'm based at Lincoln University. I also have a role in the Deep South National Science Challenge, which some of you might be familiar with, and I just wanted to flag that because we fund a range of projects, some of which are related to infrastructure. So I'd encourage you to look at our website and some of the great projects that we have funded and continue to, looking at the impacts and implications of climate change on different areas. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm sort of an economist. I look at economics and social science, thinking about how we can adapt to climate change. Thinking about the long term, some of those difficult questions I hope we can talk about today. So thank you.
Kia ora, no tūranga nui a rua a hau, ko Simon Drew toko ingoa. I'm the General Manager Infrastructure for Dunedin City Council. I'm a chartered professional engineer, not a roading engineer, picking up on Joanna's point about old work behaviours. I have spent 20 years in the predominantly private sector in the construction and consultant industry and recently flipped over to local government, so I've been 2 years with local government. I'm really excited by challenges, and Dunedin has a large section of the community and of our infrastructure that's really susceptible to climate change, in particular sea level rise. So that challenge excites me. I've been involved in multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, and dealing with climate change is by far the most complex project I've ever been involved in, and it's going to require all of New Zealand thinking, not isolated local government thinking.
Thanks, Simon. Kia ora tātou. My name is James Hughes. I work for Tonkin and Taylor. I lead the climate and resilience practice there. I've had probably a 10-year career in broadly risk and resilience and infrastructure, and have been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of the projects we've spoken about today with Anita. We've just come off the back of working on the National Climate Risk Assessment. I actually led the built environment part of that, so it was a lot of work, and Anita led the economy domain. And look, I guess just a reflection from me, and to answer Tracey's kind of question is, why is this important? Look, I think doing nothing is no longer an option. The risks are clear. If you look at the report, the risk to the built environment, but not only that, the risk to our communities and our economy. The natural environment is really at risk. Our native species, our special places that we treasure as well, and then our kids. My son, comes home and talks about climate change a lot, and he hears it at school, and there's a lot of anxiety out there. So that's why it's important, and the urgency is pretty clear as well about the speed of emissions reductions.
Yeah, kia ora. My name's Matthew Riddle. I'm the Executive Chairman of Marsh, New Zealand, also a Director. I'm here to represent the insurance industry, I think, so that'll be interesting, see how that goes. I've been in the business for over 30 years, but 20 years of that I've been involved pretty significantly with local government, so I understand there are infrastructure issues around risk transfer. I've certainly been involved in multiple losses by way of earthquake or weather events, and also involved in assisting them with, for example, recovery from government under the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act. So I've got a bit of a stake there. A little bit of wanton self-promotion, sorry, but we are a sponsor of this. I'm holding up at the moment the Global Risk Report, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which is actually a joint partnership between Marsh and the Zurich Insurance Group. If you Google Marsh Global Risk Report 2020, you'll be able to find a copy, and you'll be able to find a copy of the preceding 14 risk reports, and it's a fantastic set of data about perceptions of risk by people in the game over the last few years, well, obviously 15 years. One thing that absolutely stands out if you do look at the 2020 report and look at the risk before that is the top 5 risks in 2020-20 for likelihood are environmental. The top 5 risks for impact are environmental. Number 1 for impact is lack of climate change action, and number 2 is lack of climate change action for likelihood. So, you know, the risk world is very much interested in this topic, and infrastructure as a subset, definitely.
Fantastic. Look, I will kick off, and James, I'll put this first question to you. Climate change is just one of the many challenges that our infrastructure faces. And it's interesting, I'm just looking at Peter Reilly behind us on screen. So, you know, we have 3 sessions going on at the moment, and everyone's probably talking around many challenges that the industry is fundamentally face. So how do we balance the range of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, and if you were to list all the different challenges we're facing, you know, you'd probably run out of fingers pretty quickly. But from a climate change perspective, we're obviously dealing with the risks that we're facing, and those are very clear around, you know, you could simplify it probably to too much water or too little water. Too much water being flooding, sea level rise and coastal inundation, and particularly groundwater. We've got some real issues with high groundwater levels in a number of towns in New Zealand. It's probably a largely unknown risk. And then on the too little water, the drought and the temperature impacts, we've seen the fires. But then you move into the emissions challenge and the urgency of emissions reductions and how we build better cities and how we reconcile the drive, in my opinion anyway, the drive for building more homes and sprawling our cities, which is the way New Zealand sort of tends to build at the moment, versus the need to reduce emissions. And the challenges around biodiversity and water quality as well that we're increasingly facing. So I think there's an opportunity to address all of those if we're clever about it, but I think there's a gap at the moment in sort of in having policies and actions that address those simultaneously.
Just Anita, following on that, because you know we're going to hear a lot over the next 2 days, particularly around the you know we heard this morning around the deficit that exists in infrastructure. You know we're talking about the massive amount of infrastructure, that the pipeline that needs to be built. But how do we on that? How do we make sure that infrastructure that we build today is still very much fit for purpose for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've already heard that alluded to a few times today, which was encouraging for me. I mean, with climate change, we have quite a lot of uncertainty, along with all the other uncertainties that we face. And so, although we have quite solid projections, but we don't know how effective the world will be at reducing emissions, so we don't know which pathway we're on. So when we think about infrastructure that we're putting in now, it's very difficult to make sure that it will still be appropriate in future climates when we don't know what those climates will be. So we really need new ways of thinking and learning around this, and I think some of our tools, someone mentioned, you know, doing rigorous cost-benefit analysis for new infrastructure projects. And while, of course, that's important, it is really challenging when you've got this uncertainty because you've got the costs now, which you have to pay, and you can see them and they're measurable, but the benefits might not accrue until much later in the century, and you don't even know where or when or if they will accrue because of those uncertainties. So we do need really different types of tools, and luckily in some of the research that I'm involved in that Deep South is funding as well is thinking through some of these different types of approaches. So things like factoring flexibility in if we can, I guess maybe trying to buy yourself time with a range of options before you need to invest in something that's going to be really large and long-lived. And some of you might be familiar with the UK Thames Estuary 2100 project, which I think is a really great example of thinking like that. And also just for other things, thinking about not just picking one climate scenario because we don't know if that'll be the right one. So trying to incorporate the range of futures in your design and your cost-benefit analysis, or hopefully trying to include other approaches to those decisions, I think is really important.
And maybe Simon, just building on that, because I suppose last year, you know, James just touched on building better cities, and then the board from Infrastructure New Zealand, we went down and visited Dunedin last year, or was it the beginning of this? No, last year, where you kind of took us on a tour around, and you're faced with many challenges down there, particularly with sea level rise. You have a significant amount of homes and properties around the sort of coast. But just picking up on Anita's point really around that decision making, you know, we have a lot of uncertainty around the data and information evidence that's required to support climate change adaptation decisions and things like that. So how do you, as DCC, you know, how do you know, ensure that the data and information, so how do you make well-informed decisions around what you're kind of building for the future, or even here and now, what you're kind of dealing with?
Yeah, thanks Tracey. Thanks for giving me another opportunity to plug the challenges that Dunedin's facing. Yeah, I guess from a local government perspective, there's two elements to that. The legislative and the regulatory environment that underpin the infrastructure investment decision-making processes, complex, overlapping and evolving. So at the moment we have the RMA, which has been signalled for reform, Local Government Act, the Land Transport Management Act, the Building Act, and then alongside that sits policy statements on the coast and fresh water and urban development, and there's also Three Waters reform happening, so it creates kind of ambiguity about whose role and responsibility it is to collect data, to manage data, to understand what data is required in a really complex and uncertain world. And what I see is lots of different organisations, local governments, regional councils, central government, private infrastructure providers, the finance industry, the insurance industry, all doing slightly different things under different statutes in slightly, uncoordinated ways, and so then the data that kind of underpins all that decision is just muddied by all of the ambiguity in all of these acts.
Just following on, Matthew, I'll cut across to you now, just on that, but more, what is the role then that the insurance companies play?
Well, I think it's typically complex, but I think one of the biggest challenges the industry actually is facing is that, coming back to the comment about data sets and understanding how they actually price their capital. The inconsistency, in other words, in how some of the infrastructure is both implemented, designed. I think one of the challenges is also, is there resilience built into the life of the project from, turning the sod to actually its 50-year life expectancy? How does the industry know that it's going to be able to price that adequately and be sustainable going forward? I think one of the biggest, it's my little theme, so I'll quickly mention it, one of the biggest influences at the moment on the insurance market in this space is the regulators, and when I say that I mean in Europe. So the regulators are demanding that insurers actually have a sustainable, known, knowledgeable understanding of their risks, that they're not going to just fly by night, they're actually going to be there forever, and they're going to have a consistent view. Now, to do that, you've got to have probably a consistent view of the data. You've got to have a globally consistent view of how do you actually price and take that risk. So, yeah, there's some real challenges from a global perception, and I think that's one of the challenges that's probably been referenced about, the existing infrastructure and then the new stuff.
Look, I'll just turn to the app, and there's a couple of questions here. So one of the questions is, how can the industry better quantify the benefits and value of investing in resilient infrastructure, bringing that into business case? I don't know if James.
That's the $6 trillion question that I think most organisations are struggling with. Is everyone has a mandate and a desire to invest in resilience, yet you're trying to going back to Anita's comment, you can understand your costs, but you're quantifying those benefits where there's uncertainty, not only in the natural hazard realm, but in the climate realm, because we don't really know the direction. We know the current direction of travel around emissions, which leads to a certain warming and a certain level of sea level rise, but further out than 30 years, the scenarios diverge substantively. So it's hard to come up with, people are investing. Wellington, for example, did a big exercise in developing a resilience program business case to try and justify a significant spend of money, and that was a costly exercise. Others can reference international work that says, look, on average there's a 10-to-1 or a 6-to-1 payback period, and my view is you can run the risk of over-analysing some of these things where we've heard today. You've got to act now and invest early, and generally the benefits are there, but hard to quantify exactly.
Anita?
Oh yeah, just a couple of extra points I'd make. I guess there are some things that we can do that will generate benefits now, so win-wins for our current situation, but also to the wider question of quantifying those other types of benefits. I think we're lucky that the Treasury is trying to include and encourage people to consider wider dimensions than just purely economic well-being, so considering those wider dimensions of well-being, social and environmental, is creeping out there a bit more. And there are, again, in the academic world, there are increasing methods to try and capture some of those really difficult intangible benefits. So I think we need to keep pushing that.
Here's just another question, and James, you just touched on other countries and what they do, but given climate change will largely be determined by the 5 to 8 largest emission countries, several of whom do not focus on climate change, including the US, even with a change of president, should we focus more on resilience and adaptation? I don't know who wants to take that.
I don't want to dominate it, but I guess we have to do both. So resilience is critical for New Zealand. But I saw a graphic somewhere, and I can't remember the exact figures, but all the countries that each contribute under 1% together make up about 50%. So we have to be part of that conversation and action as well.
Maybe, Simon, this might be one for you. It's New Zealand, small but perfectly formed, an island nation, useful attributes in responding to a pandemic, but limiting our climate response impact. How do we resolve our reliance on other nations matching our efforts?
Yeah, well, I guess we've got that number 8 why mentality, haven't we? And I mean, back to my previous point, it's an all of New Zealand approach, and what I saw during COVID is we all rallied behind the same cause, and the leaders of infrastructure at this conference have the ability to raise that mandate. And I noted that Joanna used the thing disrupt old world behaviours, and Rod talked about behaviour change leadership, and I think we need to embed some of this thinking into our decision-making frameworks, and be leaders and really drive this forward.
Matthew, Joanna talked about obviously sustainable finance and lots of the models and the green bonds and green investment that kind of sits behind it. But from the perspective of the global insurers and reinsurers, what are some of the drivers which will influence your ability to be able to provide sustainable assistance?
Well, I think, as I say, front of mind at the moment is the regulators. I think they're very focused on that as both businesses themselves, in other words, the responsibilities, the governance of the directors, and also, obviously, the controls that the regulators put on their activity in the market. I know some of their concerns are about maintaining insurability. They do not, from a reputational point of view, want to actually flee the market, as it were, and that's on a global basis. One of the challenges we have in, I guess, my space is that New Zealand is very much attached to the world. We don't have the economy to sustain this ourselves. We do rely on the reinsurance market, who then support the insurance market, who then support us. So I think they are worried about that, and they are worried about, I think, the attribution of science. In other words, what is the consistency of their understanding of our risks? And we are, risk will change. I am no expert, someone can answer this one, but the risk will change in various parts of the world. New Zealand's risk will change as sea level rises. Different parts of the world will have different issues, and that will start to dominate the thinking, of course, of the capital markets, the insurers as well. So we are a little bit stuck with the rest of the world and how they go forward.
Can I just add to that? I mean, there's been some really interesting conversations around insurance, in context of climate change lately, particularly, and there's some research that's just coming out through the Deep South, but it's around the point at which insurance companies will actually partially or fully retreat based on a return period of an event. And if you look at some of the stats, if New Zealand, on average across New Zealand, 30 to 45 centimetre rise in sea levels will shift a 1 in 100 year coastal flood event to an annual event. So think about that. An event that happens 1 in 100 years will happen every year with a modest sea level rise of around less than half a metre, and that will occur in roughly mid-century according to current predictions. So that raises a whole bunch of concerns. Insurance will be gone, out. Because insurance is there to cover uncertain things, but and then it raises, a whole bunch of questions, as you all know, around who pays and who covers those sorts of
And if I just comment very briefly, there is a liability aspect to this as well. So Simon, unfortunately, will be in the here and now on that. In other words, if I'm an owner of infrastructure and it causes damage by either nuisance or negligence to a third party, that will be an issue going forward as well, because that infrastructure will be put under more and more stress as it transitions into whatever it transitions to.
Just on, I suppose, there is a lot of, we know New Zealand, there's a lot of ageing assets and ageing infrastructure and things, and locking in long-lived assets can trap us into very much old ways of doing things and old way of thinking. We've heard that this morning from PM, we don't want to go back sort of thing, and one risk is the creation of stranded assets that have really, really low economic value at the end of the day. Do you think that as an industry, an infrastructure industry, that we've been really slow to adapt to new technology and new ways of doing things, particularly digital technology?
Yeah, I do. The local government, central government are quite risk adverse because of the frameworks that underpin them. So, and as the large infrastructure owners, we have been slow to adopt to that technology. I think that's starting to change, and I guess I go back to leadership again. It's driving that change, understanding the data that we need. I see lots of solutions trying to find a problem, and it's really important that that we identify the problem and the data required to underpin that. Technology is quite a buzz thing at the moment, but often in my role I get sort of sales pitches for this technology and the latest, greatest whiz-bang bounce toy, but it's really important that we go back to what is the problem we are trying to solve, not here's a piece of technology that could solve a problem.
Yeah, I agree, and on a slightly different tack, I think there's also an issue with, what was this expression, the gravity of business as usual. We really, and this is more in a political realm, where we kind of have the ability, and there's a bunch of solutions out there that, let's take in the transport space, trying new things that might not necessarily cost a lot of money, but we could implement tomorrow. And an example is, NTTA's got a really cool program out there called Innovating Streets. So it's out there to encourage and fund councils to do innovative, low carbon, for example, active modes of transport. But getting those moving and getting the political buy-in to try something different is really hard, and that's a leadership question.
I'll just pick up on that. Dunedin City was the first to do an innovating street, and it was absolutely hated by the community because it was a change, and it was probably done in the wrong community, but the feedback to council was overwhelmingly negative.
Well, Tauranga is next in line, so everyone keep an eye on Tauranga City. They're trying something now, so we'll see if it keeps over the line.
Hopefully some lessons learned there. Just another question from the floor. What would panellists be looking for in a reformed RMA to assist the climate change response? And maybe I'll add to that because, we saw Laura in the session when she gave her what the UK was doing. And, recently the European Commission has proposed 55% carbon reduction target by 2030 as part of its EU Green Deal to eliminate climate change by 2050. And as such, we are seeing many policies go hand in hand in delivering co-benefits for each other. So how well, I know there is a session, I think, either later today or tomorrow on the reformed RMA, but how well is New Zealand doing in delivering co-benefits through our policies to tackle these sort of issues?
Well, just one aspect that I know is a really important issue is that of liability to councils. So again, some of the work that's been done in Deep South is looking at basically councils are being sued if they don't facilitate adaptation or require adaptation, and then they're being sued if they do. So at the moment they're in a really tricky position. So I think that's a key area from my perspective.
Anyone else want to?
I guess just creating some consistency to common problems, and I know the Ramsden report talked about if there is a managed retreat aspect to any solutions, that there is a framework for doing that in a consistent approach across New Zealand. Because I guess what I see at the moment is different councils doing different things and having to start from scratch for common problems?
Yeah, look, I think there's so much that's going to be included in that RMA reform, and there's so many opportunities around co-benefits. There's stuff around, for me, probably the key thing is the forget the name, the urban. What's the other part of it? The managed retreat and the urban centres one. So how do we build better cities, and how do we actually, I guess, create the right incentives to get well-designed, compact cities that create, economic value? And because in many of our small towns we've got the opposite occurring, that brings a whole bunch of other unwanted negative co-benefits through, decline and economic decline, etc.
Matthew, there's another question here, maybe you could help respond to this. Is there any real alternative to carbon taxation to ensure emissions targets are met? Sorry, I threw that one at you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, there probably are, and as you can imagine, particularly in my world, there's an awful lot of different vehicles which are explored. So I think that's when we talk about also the regulator's involvement. In other words, what type of financial vehicles are going to produce, how the capital market's going to approach. There is already solutions out there in relation to protecting investment in carbon credits, etc. So, look, I think the answer is yes, but it comes back to the same problems. It's about the data, understanding how to actually effectively price that as a financial vehicle.
And just on the funding side, there is sorry, Anita, were you
I was just going to add the Swiss cheese analogy that we had earlier about, it requires a range of measures, really, and carbon pricing is one of them.
Just on picking up on the funding, there is a question specifically for you, Simon. How is DCC thinking about their funding of their climate issues in Dunedin South? Is there someone here from Dunedin South? Clearly.
Which particular street?
That's the billion-dollar question. So my council have acknowledged there is a challenge and have a $35 million budget to invest in South Dunedin, which is one of the most susceptible communities to sea level rise. I think it's sometimes not about new financing, it's about spending the money we already have in new and effective ways and changing the focus from old world behaviour. I guess one example I'm dealing with at the moment is we're taking recycled aggregate from, you mill the road, you've got recycled aggregate, you smash down your building, you've got recycled concrete. So we're trying to create an aggregate that you can take from recycled things and then use that back in the road, so creating the circular economy. But we're caught up in the engineering profession anyway, caught up in NZTA M4 specifications and this kind of stuff, and solving these issues requires new ways of thinking, and we have to move away from some of this, taking rock from a quarry, crushing it, putting it in the road, and then digging it up, chucking it out. So it'll require some different kind of thinking and being flexible with the way we manage our infrastructure.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time. I'm fearful of, Leonard told me keep an eye on the clock, and now it's starting to flash frantically at me. Joanna, there's a question for you, and I'm going to read it out, and whoever has posted it can come and find you. It says, how do we assess investments where the outcomes is more than just commercial revenue? What is the green revenue? So whoever maybe asked that question could come find Joanna on that. But just to kind of conclude a little bit, and it's interesting what our Prime Minister said this morning, as we rebuild our economies post-COVID, we do have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to embed decarbonisation and long-term productivity into our thinking. And not only do we want to emerge from this having to kind of, and I think you touched on it there, Simon, that we want to emerge having bounced forward, really leveraging the disruption to be strong, more resilient than before. And as we're hearing of the next 2 days, we have the opportunity to really set our vision and kind of see what does that really look like for us in New Zealand. And interesting, yesterday I got a post from the Climate Change Commission on social media, and I kind of opened it up, and it said, everyone has a stake in how our country responds to climate change to help New Zealand transition to climate resilience and low emissions future. And I think that's what we've been hearing quite a lot in this room and at this, that everyone has a big role to play collectively together. And I think that's what we've seen as an industry to deal with COVID and what we've done as an industry, we have came highly collaborative together to tackle what we're kind of faced with. And I truly believe we can kind of do this together. And actually, my daughter this morning, when I told her that I was coming for this session, she recently had, she's 8, and as they do, they have to do their little sort of speeches. And she actually did it on the future. We heard from our emerging talent this morning, but it's all about how kids need to be determined the future, and it's their job to ultimately look after the world. And she had a Dr. Seuss quote in it, and this is the Dr. Seuss quote she told me about, is that unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better, it's not. So I do hope it will get better, and thank you, and I'll hand back over to Andrew. Thank you.
Actually, I might just let you sit there for a couple of minutes if you don't mind, because we've only got a couple more minutes. So first of all, thank you very much to our panellists. That was a wonderful discussion, some real world issues. And actually, I love the debate about uncertainties and how we can think about the way that we, I guess, value those benefits that aren't financial in terms of determining the right strategy to take. So right now we're going to take a bit of a pulse check in the room. Not exactly sure how this is going to work, but this is a poll. I presume it's going to involve technology. So if you've got a phone and you've loaded the app, could you please go to this poll? It's room 2B, and the question is, what are you most worried will hamper New Zealand's future development? So the questions, well, the answers are lack of vision and leadership, lack of strategy and planning, insufficient funding and financing, lack of capability, capacity and skills. And leading the charge at the moment is lack of strategy and planning. So we'll just give that one more minute. I might just use the opportunity while we're doing that just to close. I mean, I think it's been a wonderful session this morning. Hopefully, all of you have left with a better understanding of the climate risk challenges and uncertainties that we face, and also the role that infrastructure plays in terms of building a more sustainable, resilient future for New Zealand. That is it from me. We've got, I think, just a lunch announcement after that, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time. Nahi mi nui kia koutou katoa. Were there any final results there? Strategy and planning, I think, was the winner of the day. So thank you very much. Enjoy lunch. Excuse me, everyone. Sorry, not doing my MC duties very well. So we do have a lunch sponsor announcement. So this is Ilza Gotelli from Watercare. So she will just say a few words, and I think it will be followed by a video. Apologies. Ilza, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Kia ora tatu, and good afternoon, everyone. What a day so far. So 10 months ago, Watercare and our construction and design partners started the enterprise model. It's very relevant to the theme of this conference, as it is a genuine effort to help New Zealand build better, and we believe it can be utilized to support the rebuilding of this country. For our two construction partners, Fulton Hogan and Fletcher Construction, this was the start of a 10-year partnership that's headlined by our vision for sustainable infrastructure, 40-20-20. That is 40% carbon reduction, 20% cost saving, and 20% improvement in health and safety. The very foundation which the enterprise model is built on is long-term, collaborative, and integrated program-based partnership. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, the core tenets of the enterprise model are program before project, early contractor engagement in both planning and design, open book risk allocation, and the allocation of construction work to the partners. It's not competitively tendered, but allocated between our two partners. Well, the enterprise model was developed to deliver the majority of our capital program. There's been recently another benefit that I'd like to share with you today. And it highlights the themes of this conference. You may have heard of the drought that we're all gripped with here in Auckland, and as part of our response to this unprecedented event, we've embarked on a project called Waikato 50. Waikato 50 is a 50 million litre per day water treatment plant and a 225 million litre per day booster pump station. To give you an idea of scale, this is enough treated water to supply the residents of Hamilton and Tauranga combined. Waikato 50 is being planned, designed, built, and commissioned in 12-month timeframe. Using the construct of the enterprise model, we appointed Becca as the designer, and both of our enterprise model construction partners, Fletcher and Fulton Hogan, are involved. Collectively, we have built the project scope and embarked on our stakeholder engagement, consenting, and property purchases. Using the enterprise model, we kicked off early contractor involvement in the design. As the design progressed, we challenged the design and value engineered. To date, that has identified cost savings in excess of $30 million of savings and carbon reduction of 25%. Watercare has also taken on the responsibility for the purchases of critical long-term lead items to the tune of $24 million. This flexibility has allowed the project to progress at pace and to give certainty to program that would not be available under the traditional approach. The reality is this project would have taken at least 3 years had we used the tried and true traditional approach. This is a living example of how we can all deliver infrastructure at pace, in partnership, in an open and transparent way, while ensuring that we have careful eyes on cost, carbon reduction, and importantly, at all times, acting with integrity and protecting the safety and well-being of all those involved. The enterprise model is truly exciting, and it's working. And it's a way for our industry to build better. So it's been great to have a few moments to share this experience with you all today. And now for lunch. Watercare is delighted to be the sponsor of this lunch, so please enjoy. Thank you.